Good morning, sophomores, and happy snow day. As you guys will undoubtedly have found out, today we're just going to do a simple set of slides so that you guys can stay on track with what we would have normally been doing in class. So that's kind of exciting. So you'll see that today we're looking at Imperialism, Chapter 11, Section 2. And this chapter is sort of short. It goes into some details regarding the process of imperialism in Africa. Some of the stuff we've already talked about, kind of how did they do this. So understand the first how we've already covered, and that was what we were talking about regarding divide and conquer. Basically, at the Berlin Conference of 1884, the European powers met together and decided who would get to conquer what part of Africa. And so, strategically, they tended to place the various tribes who were enemies together and tribes who were friendly apart, so that you wouldn't have a problem of two tribes working together against the Europeans invading them. As a general rule, this worked for all of Africa except for two places, Liberia, which they didn't invade because it was under the control of the United States, and Ethiopia, which we'll get to here in a second. Now, about actually ruling the colony, there were two methods. The first was indirect rule. This was more or less the British way of doing things, and the way that it worked was instead of a country going on in and basically forcing the locals to follow the rules of a European, they would essentially back a very important person who was already in that country so that they would become the new leader. And then they could ask for favors, such as extraterritoriality, which is kind of important. Extraterritoriality is actually a right where a foreign citizen doesn't have to follow the laws of the country he's in. You know, if you go to a country on vacation, you are subject to that country's laws. Not so if that country grants your country the writ of extraterritoriality. This was kind of important to Europeans because they didn't want to follow the laws of the places they were in, ostensibly because they were barbaric, but also a lot of the times because the Europeans simply wanted to do whatever they want and ignore the law. So it was unlikely for them to be punished for doing something illegal when they were sent back home, which is what the law required. Furthermore, extraterritoriality grants the right to have military bases, so this was a way of the British to keep out the other Europeans as well as to enforce their will in their new colony. The second method, which is direct rule, is the French method. It's just like it sounds. They would come in and kick out all of the leaders, either executing them or disbanding their power or something like that, usually killing them. And this would result in the French taking direct control over wherever it was that they were taking over. Now, needless to say, both methods were somewhat effective, but the British method, indirect rule, was much more effective. You can see countries doing that today through trade negotiations and things like that, which is why it's sometimes referred to as neo-imperialism. So obviously the Europeans faced some resistance to their conquests. First was militarily, some successfully, some not. The Zulu were an example of a successful military resistance, at least insofar as a while. The Zulu were able to resist the Europeans due to their strict training regime and to their fairly massive empire. Not to mention, as the Europeans moved into the interior, a lot of the factors that helped them conquer the Native Americans, guns, germs, and steel, started to work against them. In a lot of cases, the Africans had some of these things. For instance, the Zulu did use steel weapons. Secondly, the germs actually worked in reverse. There were a lot of tropical diseases like yellow fever that the Africans had worked up resistances to that the Europeans simply did not. So it made the interior very difficult to settle at first. Secondly, was religious. The northern part of Africa was mostly Arab, still is today. It was conquered in the 600s AD with the Islamic expansionism under Muhammad and his later successor Abu Bakr, and so this area remained fairly Islamic. And one of the ideas that's key in Islamic teaching is that of the ulama, which basically means brotherhood. The ulama is the idea that all Muslims should help each other out and not fight. And of course, that generally is ignored, for instance, when you have Sunni versus Shiite, etc. However, it is the basis of trying to unify all Muslims together. So the Islamic Brotherhood is an example of Islamicization or Islamicism. This is what happened in Northern Africa. The Muslim leaders of these countries started proposing unification of idea of Islam, which basically meant resisting European trends. The Europeans, when they came in, tended to want the Africans to speak their language, French, English, Dutch, whatever. Furthermore, they wanted them to adopt their cultural practices. Well, Islamization was a way of pushing against this, and so try to remain independent. To this day, North Africa tends to be very independent from these attitudes, even though you might see in the southern part of sub-Saharan Africa a little bit more Euroization. Finally, political resistance. Menelik II we talked about already. This guy right here, he was the king of Ethiopia. He also was a very, very smart cookie. He understood the need to westernize, to adopt new technologies, in particular new military weapons and training. So he hired the British, I believe, it may have been the Germans, but regardless, they hired another European power in order to train his troops so that they could resist whenever they were inevitably going to be invaded. And so when the Italians actually invaded, he was able to defeat them. Give me just a second on that. That would be my dog trying to break down my door. So 1 second. Sorry about that, folks. Now Chili Dog has warm toes, baby has a pancake, everybody's happy. Okay, so we were talking about this guy and all the changes that he was making. And the other thing that we were talking about was how he westernized. So the important thing about this is he set up political associations, not just with his fellow Ethiopian peoples, although he certainly did that and resisted this intention of tribes fighting each other, but also he instituted relations with the Europeans. So basically Italy was getting pressure not only from Ethiopia, but also the European powers back home regarding their conquests. So this led to a lot of changes. However, this also leads to some pretty nasty things happening in Africa. First, let's look at the economy of Africa. The whole purpose of colonization is to ship out raw materials and open up markets, as well as a few other things that we talked about a few days ago. So if we look at the economic impacts of a nation, or in this case, a continent, having to force out its raw materials and not use those raw materials to industrialize themselves, we're basically setting this country back 160 years in terms of technology. So, if you look at Africa today, they tend to be stuck in this cycle of producing raw materials because they lack the necessary funds in order to industrialize further. Some of these countries have managed to do so and have much better economies. However, for a majority of sub-Saharan Africa, this remains an impossibility. As far as political instability is concerned, again, if we look at the map of Africa and the effects that it had by forcing tribal enemies together and tribal friends apart, to this day, a lot of political issues arise. Many of the countries that we have in Africa were established based upon colonial aims, and so you have countries with tribal enemies together who have not put these differences aside. Tribalism is an important part in the culture of various peoples in Africa. Identity is such where one must be part of a tribe or else be outside of the cultural norms of the societies. So this means that this trend is unlikely to stop. it's much more difficult to get folks to work together unless you have someone who is in charge of all of it, which basically leads to war. There have been several civil wars fought in African countries throughout the 20th century to establish a much larger stronghold of power, usually with one country backing another. The Cold War was fought using other nations as chess pieces. Uh, the United States, Great Britain, its Western allies, and NATO would back one side, and the USSR and its member nations of the Soviet bloc would back another. And so these wars would continue with Soviet or American weapons, and once the Cold War ended, these weapons would have to be funded through other means. See, for instance, blood diamonds. Lastly, the cultural upheaval that was caused by Westernization and Europeanization cannot be overstated. Euroization, whatever. Basically, whenever the colonies came in, they attempted to force these other peoples to stop their cultural traditions, ones that they've had for thousands of years. And so many of the cultures of Africa have been diminished, or in some cases made extinct by Westernization, we'll say. And so this has resulted in some pretty big upheavals, which again tends to fuel anti-Western sentiment. When you look at images on the news or on the internet of peoples in Africa who are upset with Americans, this would be why. And going back to the political instability that this causes, many of you guys talked about Coney 2012 and all that stuff. Guys, this is what's fueling that. This is what's causing a lot of these problems, this idea that the West is trying to interfere, and to some extent we are trying to control the outsourcing of raw materials that we need for manufacturing. Of course, we wouldn't consider it this way. We would consider it business and economics being separate, but the fact is that things like this are rarely separate from politics. So, long-term effects of imperialization is Africa. The economy has been affected, politics have been affected, and culture has been affected. All right, guys, that's pretty much it for the notes today. I would encourage you to get all these written down with all the various bits and pieces that you may have missed. Feel free to pause as needed so you can get everything. And if you have any questions, I'll be on email. So, hope you have a good snow day. Hope you guys get a chance to get out and build a snowman. And I'll see you guys, hopefully, in the not-too-distant future. Take care.